Hello everyone, this is Alice at welldoing.org, and today I'm speaking to Michelle Elman, who is a life coach and the author of The Joy of Being Selfish, which is a great book all about setting boundaries. So thank you so much for joining me, Michelle. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you. So you're a life coach yourself, but you write a lot in the book about how important coaching was for you as an experience. So I wondered if first you might be able to tell us a bit about that, what took you there and what the benefits were.
Yeah, absolutely. So the original intention was to become a psychologist, and I was doing my degree in psychology when I had an experience of PTSD myself, and I found there were certain limitations or ways that talking therapy didn't quite go with my way of thinking, and so I started looking at other approaches. And I believe that there are a million different options and they're all wonderful. It's so great we have all those choices, but as a professional, you need to believe in the model you're preaching. And in order for you to actually stand behind all of the techniques you're suggesting to other people, you need to have tried them yourself. And because I had such an impactful experience of boundaries, learning boundaries through life coaching, but also life coaching in general, especially helping with my PTSD, that kind of changed my career path that I decided to become a life coach instead.
Amazing. That's wonderful. So you went to coaching to help you get through your experience of PTSD. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of just it came at the right time because it came in the last year of university where I was about to graduate anyway. And I found I preferred that life coaching was more future focused.
Great, great. That makes sense. And the book is all about boundaries, which is such an important topic and something that I think a lot of people find very difficult. So maybe we could start with just what a boundary is.
Yeah, so boundaries are simply how we teach people to treat us. It's all about treatment. So, what is and isn't acceptable. And it's as simple as the same way your house has a fence, we also have a boundary around us, except we can't see it. But that's the difference between you and me. And we need to know where that line is in order to protect what's yours, but also protect what's mine. So, that could be your emotions, that could be your opinions, that could be actual jobs that you need to do in the workplace.
Mm, mm, amazing. And so what happens if we don't have that fence, if we don't have those boundaries?
If you have no boundaries, you tend to be burnt out, exhausted, overworked. You tend to be quite unfulfilled because you're so busy saying yes to everyone else's needs and everyone else's demands that there's very little time for yourself. And usually, the reason why you have bad boundaries is due to a lack of self esteem. So you don't feel like you can say no. You concern yourself too heavily with being disliked by other people. And so the opinions of others weighs more importantly than your needs or what you desire in from your own life because you're so concerned with what other people want from you. And it's usually because you don't feel good enough in yourself that you overcompensate with what you can do for others.
That makes sense. And so why is it that boundaries, like setting boundaries, is so scary?
Well, because it confronts that fear of being disliked, and also the result right after you've set boundaries, what you might find, especially the first few times, is you'll feel a level of guilt. And that's because within our society, we've been taught that saying no is a bad thing. So you feel guilty for it because guilt is an emotion that arises when you feel like you've done wrong. And you have to reassure yourself and also remind yourself that there's a difference between rational guilt for something like if you do something to purposely harm someone, and then there's an irrational guilt for setting a boundary, which isn't intentionally going to harm people, but their response to your boundary isn't your responsibility. You can only control what's on your side of the street.
Mm, mm. And that's a really good point about guilt, and that feels like maybe one of the misconceptions there might be about boundaries and whether or not they're okay. What other kind of common myths would you say there are about this area?
In the book there's a whole chapter on myths because there are so many misconceptions around boundaries, and I think it's one of those things that happen when a word becomes mainstream. So for a long time this was a very psychology based word that would be used within therapy, within life coaching, and as it went through the mainstream, most people have heard of the word boundaries, but they can't actually define it. And so what ends up happening is we confuse boundaries with walls, and we use these walls to push people away when actually boundaries are um, are deciding who you want in your life. It's not about pushing everyone away, it's about pushing the wrong people away. But there are so many misconceptions, particularly around women setting boundaries, that it's rude, aggressive. And I say it's particularly aimed towards women because when a man sets boundaries, he's often called confident, self assured. He knows himself well. Whereas with women, I mean, the reason why it's called the joy of being selfish is because one of the words used most against women when they set boundaries is selfish. And it's not selfish. And the fact that we are so okay with self-care and self-love, but then you hear the word selfish and you go, oh no, that's too far. Well, actually, that's a very compulsory part of self-love and self-care, because you'll have no time and energy to look after yourself if you're taking care of everyone else first. And in order for you to put yourself higher on your priority list, the unfortunate side effect is someone has to go lower. And so even though it's not convenient for that other person, and therefore these name callings might happen, whether it's selfish or rude or aggressive or simply just mean, you're being mean by setting a boundary, it's simply because they're trying to persuade you to not set that boundary, because that boundary doesn't benefit them.
Mm-hmm. And we come into this place as well just about communication, and maybe none of us having had sufficient lessons in how to communicate, being on the, speaking and on the receiving end of things like this when we haven't experienced it before.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, if your parents didn't know how to set boundaries, then that gets passed on. Whereas on the flip side, if your parents have really good boundaries, they set boundaries with you, you also actually feel like there was a permission to set boundaries with them as well. So actually, I was just creating a piece of content for Instagram about how you can teach children from a very early age, from as young as being a toddler, as soon as they can speak, that you don't have to just give people hugs. People need to ask before they get a hug, and that you can say no as a child. But often we're taught the opposite of give your uncle a hug, even if you don't want to, even if you're crying, you're being rude, give them a hug. And it's overriding your need in that moment. Whereas if we set the precedent for your needs come first, you should listen to your body, you should listen to what your body's telling you, then you have that example for the rest of your life.
And that leads into this question around, how do you know if a boundary's been crossed?
So it usually means that anger and resentment rises up within you. And I think the go-to response, if you aren't used to validating your emotions, is, oh, I don't know why I'm angry. Oh, I shouldn't be angry. And invalidating it and saying that whatever has just happened is not a big enough reason to have the amount of emotion you have inside you. Instead, you need to actually listen to it, because what you'll find is if you set the boundary, you feel that anger, you set the boundary, the anger disappears. The emotion's trying to tell you something, and it's trying to make you reinstate that boundary. Once you've set that boundary, once you've stood up for yourself, you'll find the anger disappears because you've taken action on it. Emotions are designed to be temporary, but they're designed to make you take action. It's only when you don't take action on that emotion that the emotion stays in your body, and that's when the emotion sticks around for a long time, and you end up with people screaming on the road or at waiters at things that are completely unrelated to what they're actually angry about, because they've let their boundaries be crossed so many times.
Mm-hmm. And this doesn't mean that a boundary has to be communicated in an angry way, does it?
No. So when I say anger, it's you feel the anger in your body and you communicate it in an emotionally neutral place. Now, that might mean you have to take yourself away from the situation and process that anger separately. That might mean you only set the boundary a week later, a month later, a year later. There is no time limit on when you set the boundary. If you need time to process things, then ask for that time. Don't use that space as a way to punish the person, because that ends up being the silent treatment, but just simply saying, I'm having a lot of feelings about this right now. Can I just take 5 minutes and I'll come back to you when I'm ready to talk about this? If you're in a professional workplace, then just leave the situation and then send an email about it later. You don't actually have to have the conversation in the moment. You're allowed to take the time you need.
That's a really great point. And obviously for lots of people, this would involve quite a major life change, relationship change. So what might happen when people start setting different boundaries?
Yeah, so I think, especially my personal experience of setting boundaries, I went through a lot of friendship loss mainly in my life. And I think that's because, like, for now looking on 5 years later, I'm like, you know what? Fair enough. Like, they didn't agree to be in a relationship with someone who had really good boundaries. They agreed to be friends with someone who was a pushover, who was a people pleaser, and that's what they signed up for. So when you go through this drastic change, whether in terms of any personal development, you will lose people along the way because humans inherently don't like change. If you change, you remind them that they're able to change, and if they're not taking the changes they need to make in their own life, then that will be inconvenient for them. But also, you're turning into a different person, and they're allowed to make that decision that you don't want each other in your lives, or that your friendship's just not healthy for either of you. And in those moments, it can feel really like you're making the wrong decisions, that maybe your boundaries are too firm, or maybe you've gone too far with boundaries, when actually what I found is that boundaries will only get rid of the wrong people in your life, and the right people will respect your boundaries. And what you'll actually start to notice is the people who have the hardest time adjusting to your boundaries were the people who are taking advantage of your lack of boundaries in the first place.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And I wondered as well whether you had any other like tips for setting boundaries. So you spoke about being emotionally neutral. What other kind of advice might you have?
So keep it as short as possible. I think sometimes when we're insecure about the boundary we're setting, we waffle on and on and on. And the problem is, the longer you talk, the more you give the other person to pick apart their statements. And if you say things like, well, you do this all the time, then they'll start going, I don't do that all the time. I didn't do that one time, and start nitpicking around details. So say less rather than more. And that's the way you keep it really succinct. And ultimately, the best boundary and the first boundary we will all learned is simply the word no. And being able to use that without a justification is a really strong skill. So when you decline an event, you don't need to give a reason why. If you cancel, yes, give a reason. But if you decline in the first place, no one needs to know whether it's because you actually have another event to attend, or whether you just want to sit on your sofa and do nothing. That's a perfectly valid reason, and it's no one's business other than your own what you're doing with that time. But I think we're so in the habit of thinking everyone is so to be honest, everyone's thinking about us all the time, when actually a lot of the time they aren't. And once you start even something as simple as declining events without a justification, you'll realize how a lot of the time they're not going to ask for a reason, because they don't care. They just wanted a reply. They wanted the answer. They didn't really care for why you weren't coming. But because we feel insecure in saying no, we're the ones who are projecting our own discomfort.
That's so interesting. And it makes a lot of sense. And there's something in there as well, which I think you mentioned in your book, about trusting that other people are okay to manage things as well, rather than feeling like you have to constantly look after, like you're responsible for other people's feelings.
Exactly. They're allowed to have a moment of discomfort. And I also give the example in my book of the first time I did it. And my friend, even weeks later, he brought it up and was like, yeah, that was strange. And I was like, strange just means different. Like, yes, it was strange to him because I'd never done it before. I never said no to an invite. I did it in a clumsy and awkward way. And that probably is going to happen when you set boundaries for the first time. You're trying something new. You're not going to be perfect the first time. But so what? I acted a bit strange for a few minutes, and he adjusted to it. And the next time I said no, it was a little bit less strange.
Not the end of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And about this emotional processing, I really loved how you spoke about scheduling it in. So even if you don't have the time to deal with the emotions just now, even the act of making a mental note or putting it in your diary that you have time to deal with how you're feeling later can really help you get on with your daily tasks and everything else that is part of being alive and out in the world. And I just wondered about, like, how do people do that themselves? And also, is that somewhere like therapy and coaching might come into that for people on a weekly basis?
Absolutely. So it's particularly something I use ahead of public speaking. So if I have a talk that day, I can't start crying in the morning, because who knows if I'm going to be able to switch it off in time and get myself in the right headspace. So what I'll tell myself is I will literally take my diary and go, okay, so, and it reassures your unconscious mind, being like, okay, this is the time. But the key to this is you actually have to follow through on your promise. If you say you're going to sit down on Saturday evening and feel your feelings, when you suddenly get offered a house party instead, you can't just go to the house party, because then your brain stops believing you, because every time you're like, no, we'll deal with it later, you actually don't deal with it later. It's more of a putting off or delaying tactic. So how I do think therapy and life coaching helps, because a lot of the time when we feel this overwhelm of emotions and we're not really sure how to deal with it, it's because too many things have accumulated at once, and we didn't deal with that first drop in the buckets, but we only dealt with the bucket once it was overflowing. And so it's about, I do think there's an element of therapy and life coaching that is almost maintenance, more so than only fixing it when there's a problem. And so if you can get in the habit of noticing your emotions when they're small, when you feel sadness and not just when you're bawling with tears, or when you're feeling angry in your body but before you're shouting, you actually you're able to catch it and process it before you are at the point where you're unable to control your reaction. And I think we also need to learn the difference between an emotion being healthy and potentially your reaction is unhealthy. So as you said previously, like with anger, anger is a healthy emotion. You can channel it into so many things. I channel a lot of my creativity from anger. I especially when like around body positivity, if I see a body shaming sign, it often sparks a lot of my creativity. I don't go around yelling at people because I'm annoyed about some body shaming sign. So it's about having that control and channeling it in the right way. But sometimes, a lot of the time, because it's hit upon a wound, usually from a younger stage in our life, we feel like we have no control over it. That it does take basically allowing yourself and validating yourself to feel all your feelings for a really long time to be able to get that control. And I'm 8 years into now being, not only being a life coach, but being in life coaching myself. And so it was many, many years of just letting myself cry for all the years I didn't let myself cry, letting myself scream into a pillow so I didn't scream at a person. And even if I said something like screaming at a pillow, people would go, well, that doesn't sound very healthy. Well, actually, it is. Expressing any emotion where you're not hurting yourself or another person is a healthy way of expressing an emotion. But whenever you're hurting yourself or someone else, that's when you need to control your reaction and realize that there's a difference between how you're reacting and the emotion itself.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. It's insightful and it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Your book is called The Joy of Being Selfish, and I'd recommend it to anyone who wants to learn more about boundaries.
Thank you so much.